This is the arcade classic 1980 Centipede by Atari. I did not personally have a ton of experience with this game in the arcades as a kid, but I did see it from time to time. It is definitely one of the more unique of that early golden age, as people call it, of arcades in the late 70s and early 80s. Granted, you're still a little thing shooting stuff, but in an age when a lot of games were either clones of a shooter like Galaga or clones of Pac-Man, the winding maze of mushrooms and the slithering centipede that you have to fight was very unique. Very unique for its era. Very unique for its time. So, Centipede was created by Atari employees Ed Logg and Dona Baily. It was designed by both, mainly Logg, and it was programmed mainly by Dona Baily, who was, as a matter of fact, the only woman employed by the arcade division of Atari at the time. It was originally ported to the Atari 2600 in the 80s. It was actually one of the 2600's, I would say, biggest hits. Like the first major hit for the Atari 2600 was a port of Space Invaders. First big Atari 2600 hit, like big seller, was a port of Space Invaders. Centipede was another one of its big hits, even though obviously the 2600 had limitations. They would later port it to the Atari 5200, and then even later, when it didn't matter quite so much, they ported it to the Atari 7800 system, which was kind of Atari's last gasp attempt at competing with the Nintendo Entertainment System, etc., staying in the home market. Centipede was also ported to home computers, but it was not ported to the NES. As for the creators, Dona Baily would go on to work for a company called Vidya in 1982, which later was renamed Centa Technologies. They made a few arcade games, but they weren't of any real note. Ed Logg, on the other hand, he started out with Atari. He made Super Breakout, which was a big hit for them, sequel to the original Breakout. And he would go on, aside from Centipede, he created the sequel Millipede. He would go on to co-develop Gauntlet. And in the 90s, he worked on 3D games such as Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey and the San Francisco Rush racing game. One of the notable things about Centipede is that it used a trackball instead of a joystick. Several games, especially Atari games, arcade games in the early to mid 80s used trackballs instead of joysticks. And honestly, it is kind of better to roll around. It can be faster to roll that ball instead of moving a joystick around. But it can the bad part about trackballs is that they can also break easier and get really dirty. Now this is a game I have less experience with, but this is the sequel, Millipede. It was released in the arcades in 1982. It was released to various Atari platforms in the 80s, and it actually was ported to the NES in 1988. If you ask me, the more popular original game should have been ported to the NES, but it wasn't, because, why not? Millipede is, as you can see, a lot more of the same. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, although it did have many additions, such as various new enemies, like the earwig, the beetle, I think, the bee, an inchworm, that if you hit it, it slows down the enemies for a little bit of time, and a dragonfly. And as you might have already seen, there's a new item, the DDT bomb, that you can see up at the top of the screen there, which takes out a specific block in its immediate radius if you hit it. It'll kill enemies and mushrooms, I think, in that specific radius. And yeah, there's these little sections where there's raining fucking enemies and shit. I don't know for a fact, but I feel like they might have also tweaked the mushroom mechanic in this game compared to the original. The original still had, you could shoot the mushrooms to eliminate an obstacle, even though the mushrooms also kind of shielded you a little bit from the enemies. And they would gradually grow back over time. As you can see, the screen also will gradually kind of fall down on you in your little player plane there. I never really played Millipede as a kid. I don't have a lot of experience with it. However, I did own, on my IBM-compatible 386 PC that we got around 1993 or so, I did own this game called Microsoft Arcade, Volume 1, which was a bunch of Atari arcade games, and it included this, it included Tempest, a first-person vector graphics tank game called Battlezone, and Missile Command. It had 5 games total. And as I recall, it also had a weird bonus trivia game that you could play that included some, weird... It had a bunch of video game trivia, but it also had, comic book trivia. That's where I learned that one of the original Billy Batson Captain Marvel superhero, one of his main villains was a little worm called the Brain or something like that, I think. It was just a little worm, and I thought that was funny, and I had no idea at the time who Captain Marvel was, or that there were 2 different Captain Marvels. But anyways, that's Millipede, that's Centipede. It's a noteworthy arcade game. There wasn't really, to my knowledge, a whole lot like Centipede. As I said, it was definitely just a shooter in some respects, because the main mechanic of the game is that you're a little ship, just like in Space Invaders, just like in Galaga, etc., and you move around on a certain plane on the screen, and you have to avoid enemies, and you have to avoid shots, and you shoot enemies. But the unique elements of the main enemy, the titular Centipede, kind of winding its way through this maze of mushrooms that you also have to shoot. And granted, shooting mushrooms as an obstacle to get them out of your way so you can actually hit the enemy is taken somewhat from the barriers in Space Invaders. But still, unlike Space Invaders where you've only got a few little barriers, in Centipede, as you saw, there's this whole fucking forest of giant mushrooms, and you not only have to get them out of the way, but the enemy kind of uses them in a sense, winding around them, and also they grow back over time if you don't shoot them and erase them completely. And it's just, it had some good ideas for the time. And of course, Ed Logg went on to be known and recognized as one of the top, most important, game developers of all time for the hits that he made. And Dona Baily, even though this is her only notable game that she ever made, she is still an important part of game history, being one of the only original arcade game developers that was a woman. And as I understand it, these days she actually teaches game development theory, or she gives lectures and things like that. Atari was a major force in the 70s and 80s, not just, not just with the, there. A lot of people remember Atari now, or kind of collectively, social consciousness. They're aware of Atari because they were the pioneer, or one of the pioneers, of the home video game console market. But they were also big players in the arcades, man. They were very important in the arcades. And Centipede was one of their big hits. So, until next time, keep blasting those bugs.
The centipedes are coming. Get your fingers moving fast, and the spider's out to get you. Do you think that you can last? You can shoot him in the middle. He will only break in two. And the fleas are even faster if you look away you're through. See the scorpion a dancing? He can really help you score. But the centipede's immortal, keeps coming back for more. Centipede is from Atari and is faster than a jet. If you're looking for some action, it's the game you gotta get. Centipede!